Friends, we have the great privilege today of hearing from one of the books of the Old Testament that we have a very rare occasion to hear on a Sunday. It's a reading from the book of Sirach. In the Old Testament, there are really three different parts. There's three different types of books. There is the law, there is the prophets, and there is the books of wisdom. The law, of course, is the Torah. Those are the first 5 books of Moses in which the 10 Commandments were composed and written. And from those 10 Commandments were composed 613 laws that were able to be applied in specific situations for the Israelite people. They had to make certain provisions in the law because one of the laws, of course, was keep holy the Sabbath, which means that you had to go to the temple and worship God on Sabbath, which would have been their Saturday. But the problem is that when they were in periods of war or there was an enemy attacking them, the enemy knew that they weren't allowed to fight on their Sabbath. And so you can guess which day they attacked them. Because imagine if there was a day where you had a rule where you had to just sit with your hands on your lap and somebody wanted to destroy you, well, they would just wait for that day. And as you were defenseless, they would level you, basically. So they had to make certain provisions in the law in order to defend themselves because people would just attack them on their Sabbath. So there was 613 laws from the 10 Commandments, and that was the book of the Torah. The second part was the prophets, and we hear about the prophets from almost the beginning of the liturgical year all the way to the end. They are prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. There were several major ones and several minor prophets. And the last section of the Old Testament contains the book of wisdom, the books of wisdom. They include things like the Psalm, and then our first reading today from the book of Sirach. And the wisdom literature really centers around trying to grapple with the understanding of how God interacts with his people. How God interacts with his people. Indeed, the whole Bible is really the history of humanity's interaction with God. And the wisdom literature is a way of people trying to put down these eternal truths that are for all time eternally true. They are just part of the human condition, and they attempt to describe the way God interacts with us in order to act rightly. That's why Paul says in the first letter to the Corinthians today, our second reading, he says, "We speak a wisdom to those who are mature, not a wisdom of this age." What he means by that, of course, is eternal wisdom, wisdom that is applicable in every age. So I want to just take a few comments from the first reading here first, because I think they're very important. And the first few words, the first 3 words, are absolutely essential to understand our human condition. The first 3 words are, if you choose. If you choose. The first thing you recognize is the first word is if. That's a conditional sentence. It means if this is fulfilled, then this will happen. Implicit in that is if this is not fulfilled, then this will not happen. If you choose. Conditional sentence, but the word choose implies the entire interaction between God and humanity. Free choice. We call it free will. The ability to make a decision. There's 2 ways, friends, that we can understand free will, I think wrongly, in the way God interacts with us. We can either think of God as giving us commandments for no other reason than he likes to make us certain puppets and just sort of play with us as if the world is God's playground, and he leads us by paths that we don't know, and what he really is doing is entertaining himself. Well, this is really ridiculous because God doesn't need anything. He's perfectly content in himself. His love and his creation is love created because he doesn't need us. He doesn't need our love. He wants it, but he doesn't need it because he's not us. He's perfectly content on his own. The other error we can have is perfect autonomy. In other words, we don't need God's grace. We don't need God at all. God can pretty much be left to the side. God's not interested in either of those 2 extremes. I think the best word we can probably come up with, or maybe 2 different words, are cooperation with God's grace or participation in his grace, where we, in a sense, make decisions with God. So friends, those first three words, if you choose, imply a whole gamut, a whole fountain of, if you will, of issues. Because human beings have free will, it means they can either choose to love God or choose to hate God. A love that is forced is not a love at all, which is why freedom in God becomes one of the most beautiful gifts and at the same time one of the most dangerous, because we can choose against God's will. Again, the condition for choice to make love possible also includes the condition to make hatred possible. And so it goes on, if you choose, you can keep the commandments. The commandments, again, are those fundamental 10 laws that God gave us in the Old Testament, again, not for his benefit, but for ours. We come to worship God in Sunday Mass not because God needs it, but because we do. In fact, in the preface prayer before we say the Eucharistic prayer today, we're going to say, Lord, our praise adds nothing to your greatness, but profits us for salvation. Why? What is God saving us from? Well, in my experience, God is saving us ultimately from ourselves. He's saving us from turning in on ourselves and making decisions that are always beneficial to us and ignoring the rest of the people around us. Remember that God, in creating us in love, created us completely freely out of love simply because he wanted to share his life with us. God is generous. He simply wanted us to share his life with him. In fact, they say that when the angels rebelled in heaven, it was because of that, because Lucifer was jealous of human beings. That God would invite creatures, earthly creatures, into his heavenly realm. And Lucifer didn't like that. The eternal wisdom, friends, is that we have free choice, but we are not given freedom to choose whatever we want. Every one of us knows, and it doesn't matter what you believe or what creed you profess, that there are certain actions that are praiseworthy and certain actions that are blameworthy. If you choose one thing, you can be congratulated for it, that's good. If you choose another thing, the opposite, you would be ridiculed. Okay, that's before even what's really good and what's really bad. People know that actions are either praiseworthy or blameworthy, which means they're either good or bad. The question is, what are really good actions? They don't come from the world. They don't necessarily come from governments. They don't come from televisions or magazines. They come from the eternal wisdom, which is God himself. And he has revealed that eternal wisdom, given us the guide on what makes us truly human. God has no interest in treating us like robots. He wants us to freely enter into a relationship with him, which again, those first three words, if you choose, are essential in describing the entire experience with God in creation. At the very beginning, Adam and Eve chose to follow the influence of the evil one rather than simply trusting that God's law was true and they could have that full relationship with him. The commandments are always for our good. And remember several months ago, maybe more than a year ago, I talked about a quote from Bishop Sheen that said very simply, indifference to good and evil will eventually lead to hatred for what is good. If we're indifferent to what's good or evil, we'll eventually lead us to what is hatred for what is good. And the ultimate good, of course, is God. I don't think there's so many people that don't believe in God as I think there are people that hate God. A young woman that I was interacting with several years ago in confirmation class, she was very obstinate, and she was very insistent that I do not believe God. Well, I knew that her parents were divorced, she had a difficult home life, and I simply asked her, is it that you don't believe in God, or do you hate him? And that hit right on the target. So she realized that it wasn't indifference that she had to the rules, it was that the relationship with God wasn't there because of the difficulty in her family. Friends, I want to tell you something that's very important for your spiritual life, and I want you to notice it. God always gives us a choice between good and evil. When it comes to sin, we are often reduced mentally to the idea that we have no choice. Let me say that again. God always gives us options. Two paths, it says, he lays out before us, life and death, good and evil. Whatever he chooses shall be given him. That when it comes to sin, you will notice in your life your mind is reduced to the fact that you believe you have no choice but to do this or that. That is not freedom. That is slavery. Notice that. That came to my mind once years ago when my brother had a very good friend who had taken his life. And we were having a late night conversation, and he said, you know, I think that was it. He felt like he didn't have another choice. And as I started to think about that, I started thinking, you know, that's all sin. You know, when I choose to fast from meat on Fridays, for example, which we're supposed to do as Catholics even still unless we give something up, the times that I do eat meat and I consciously know that I'm making excuses, right? And I eventually come to the point where I have to do this because either I'm entitled or because I deserve it for whatever other reason. But that's a limit of freedom. God gives us freedom. And so Jesus today in our gospel, real quickly with the 10 Commandments, he proposes these 10 Commandments again as they had always heard. And when he says, you have heard that it was said to your ancestors, you shall not kill, and whoever kills will be liable to judgment, what he's talking about is what God's law was. Jesus, in some sense, is taking the prerogative of God. You have heard God say, you shall do this, but I say, you know, how would that work out as parents, right? I always use this example. If you tell your kids to clean their room and they say, you have heard it said, you shall clean your room, but I say, you shall go outside and play. Now, how would that sit with you as parents? Well, you can imagine that's what Jesus is saying here. You have heard that it was said, but I say, and the people looking think, who are you to say what differently than what God said? Because Jesus is God. And friends, he's taking the commandments no longer external, but he's taking them to the heart. There is nothing in your actions, humanly speaking, that is not first in your mind. There is nothing in your actions that is not first in your mind. And there is nothing in your mind except that which you choose to expose yourself to. There's nothing in your mind except that which your senses take in. We talk about guarding our senses, being careful about what we see, being careful about what we hear. The reason is because that puts thoughts and ideas in our mind, and there's nothing in our mind that isn't first in our mind that comes out in our actions. The battle between good and evil is here. And that's why, friends, we need the grace of God to wash over us. God is taking things to the heart because that's where he wants to be most present to us, to invite us to that eternal reality. So again, free choice, friends, yes. Is it a beautiful gift? Yes, it gives us the capacity to love freely. Is it a dangerous gift? Yes, because it also allows us to choose against God. So friends, today as we hear our gospel in our first reading, let's echo that eternal wisdom to know that choices made in freedom are always given to us to choose what is good. And today especially, friends, as so many people are becoming so, as us Catholics need to be, we need to save ourselves from the indifference to that. And if we do as it says in that first line, those commandments will save us.